It's interesting here that Job simply is agreeing with the fact that God cares for the righteous. Job knows that. He understands that very well. And then what we see here, if you read chapter 9 here, Job affirms very clearly the sovereignty of God. Job is not struggling with the sovereignty of God. He recognizes it, and he even affirms it by his quotes and by what he says here in chapter 9. So that's not an issue. But Job's confusion is voiced here, basically regarding how one can effectively plead innocence. And that's what he's struggling with. If you look at verses 13 down through verse 24, that seems to be what he's struggling with. That seems to be somewhat an area of confusion for Job. But understand, he is absolute about the sovereignty of God. But there are some issues that in questions, as we have discussed already, Job is just wanting to know some things a little bit more. He's wanting some things to be clarified. And then in chapter 9, I have done this. You have done this. I know many people that I've talked to in my life, in my 45 years. People want their day in court with God. That's exactly what Job is saying. Job says, all right, I want a mediator or a go-between. Now, for us under the new covenant, of course, our mediator is the Lord Jesus. If you read 2 Timothy, that's what we learn. But that's what Job is saying. He wants a meeting with God. Let's take a look at that. Let's pick it up in verse 33. Chapter 9, verse 33. Nor is there any mediator between us who may lay his hand on us both. Now, you just have to understand, this is somewhat of a cultural thing. When somebody, years ago, an older man who was looked up to as a days. The old King James uses the word daysman, which is a mediator, but it's where he would take both defendant, take the two individuals who have this disagreement, and he would get between them, and he would lay his hands on them, and then he would make the verdict. Either guilty or innocent. And that's sort of how it was done. But that's what Job is asking for. Who may lay his hand on us both? Let him take his rod away from me, and do not let him dread of him terrify me. Then I would speak and not fear him, but it is not so with me. In fact, Job may have been that mediator in his past. He may have been the man who laid his hands on these individuals and then made a verdict. The indictment was given, litigation was involved. He, as a judge, sort of lays his hand on them, and then he makes the verdict. That's what he wants. God wants to meet God in court. Job wants to meet God in court. But he says, but it's not so. And so Job wants this mediation to take place. And then he addresses God, it seems, in chapter 10. My soul loathes my life. I will give free course to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Show me why you contend with me. Now that word contend is an interesting word. We can break it down and look at it, but that's pretty bold and blunt. This is what Job is saying. Job, seemingly in his lack of understanding or in his confusion, he just wants to meet with God. I mean, it seems he wants to have it out with God. Have you ever met somebody who just wants to have it out with God? I mean, because they question everything, and they just wish that they could just have a little bit of God's time and just say, okay, now, why? And that seems to be what Job is doing here. And then again in chapter 10, 18 through the end of the chapter, why then have you brought me out of the womb? Oh, that I had perished, and no eye had seen me. I would have been as though I had not been. I would have been carried from the womb to the grave. And I've met people like that. People just can't wait to die. They just want to die. Isn't that amazing? But this is what, listen to him. I would have been as though I had not been. I would have been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Cease, leave me alone, that I may take a little comfort. Before I go to the place from which I shall not return, to the land of darkness and to the shadow of death, a land as dark itself, as the shadow of death without any order, where even the light is like darkness. Do you feel his pain? Do you sense his sorrow, his anguish, his hurt? He wants to know why. Listen, God, meet me in court. I've got a few questions for you. Have you met people who've ever lamented the day of the birth? I have. Chapter 11. Zophar, the Naamathite, he answered and said. And then he seems, you thought Bildad was rough on Job. If you look in this chapter 11, this is all there is. He only speaks very little compared to the others. Again, he seems to be the most harsh of the three, particularly with his rebukes against Job. He says that Job's words, the words of Job, everything that Job has spoken, they must be answered. He wants God to speak against Job and basically claim punishment is less than he deserves. All here in chapter 11. And then I like in verse 5, chapter 11, verse 5. He says, but oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you. That he would show you the secrets of wisdom, for they would double your prudence. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves. In other words, Job, listen, it could be worse. If you're a counselor or somebody who likes to give advice to people and likes to share with people and try to help people, I mean, are we just going to right out of the gate and say, you know what? I mean, and maybe we have said, but I think it's probably the tone in which the way it was said. You know what? It could be worse. And he said, listen, you deserve worse. Because less than your iniquity deserves. Because of the words, because everything that you said, you deserve a whole lot worse. You know, I'm not sure I'd want to talk to this fellow. I don't know about you. I don't think I would give him a time of day. If you're hurting, and we all understand the pain and the sorrow that Job has gone through. I mean, does he really need to hear this? Isn't that inflicting more wound? Is that not inflicting more pain, more hurt, and more sorrow? And this is why Job will say, you're all worthless counselors. You're worthless. And by the way, Job will tell them, I believe it's back in chapter 6, Job says, you know, you're terrified and you're afraid yourself. That's an interesting statement that he doesn't let these guys off the hook, it seems to me. So this is, that was Zophar. And he just accuses Job of basically trying to hide his sin. And then we come to Job again. And this is his response in these several chapters here. chapters 12